Welcome to the Tragically Beautiful podcast, where we navigate life after abuse through the real stories of survivors. Join us as we hear from those who emerged from abusive relationships, as well as experts who offer practical wisdom, and together we'll explore how to turn tragedy into something truly beautiful. This is episode 38, Exploring Your Hunger for Love. Hey there, friends. Welcome to this brand new season of the Tragically Beautiful podcast. I took January and February off from recording and releasing episodes in order to focus on a few other projects, but now I'm back and I'm so excited about this season and all the guests I already have lined up for you. This season, I really want to focus on filling the gaps in the episodes I've released in the past. I want to find those wild and wonderful nuances that will help people think about their abuse and their healing in a brand new way. Maybe even making the entire process just a little bit easier. We're kicking off this season with a really interesting topic that I don't know about you, but it never crossed my mind before. These are the kinds of things I want to bring you this year. Oh, we're still going to feature the stories of abuse survivors. That's not going anywhere. I think it's incredibly important for abuse survivors to have a space to share their stories, and it's the entire reason I started this podcast, so those aren't going anywhere. But the structure that I'm hoping to maintain is to have an abuse survivor story on the 1st of each month and a professional or expert on the 15th of that same month talking about the type of abuse or the struggle that the abuse survivor talked about earlier that month. It may not always work out that way, but that's the direction I'm trying to go. My guest today kind of fills both of those roles, an abuse survivor herself who used her experience to shape her career path, and drew some pretty interesting conclusions that I think many of us might be able to relate to. I think you'll definitely have an aha moment or two while you're listening. But before we get started, I wanted to ask you a question. Have you ever felt like others crossed lines with you in ways that made you feel irritated or even uncomfortable? Maybe you've struggled to hold your ground, worried about losing those around you. If you've experienced an abusive relationship, you know how hard it can be to protect your own space and feel secure again. If you can relate to any of this, I want you to consider my ebook, Reclaim Your Connection, Build Healthy Boundaries and Relationships After Abuse. This isn't just an ebook. It's a supportive guide to help you take back control, find your voice, and set the boundaries that protect your emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being. Inside, you'll learn the true benefits of setting boundaries, work through challenges that might come up, and discover activities to create a personalized plan that really works for you. We're coming up on springtime very soon, which means more interactions with family members, friends, acquaintances, and even strangers. So this is the perfect time to take advantage of the tips and boundary-strengthening activities in this ebook. Because here's the truth. You deserve relationships that feel safe and fulfilling. You deserve to feel respected, valued, and seen. And you deserve peace. So give yourself the gift of peace, security, and healthy relationships. I've linked the ebook in the show notes for you, so head on over there and grab your copy of Reclaim Your Connection today. Let's start this journey together. Hello, beautiful friends. Welcome back to the podcast. I hope that you're doing well and staying warm wherever you are. Today, I've got something really special in store for you. My guest is Jillian Scott, master life and weight loss coach and founder of the Body You Crave method. She helps high-caliber men and women lose weight and easily maintain it, eating the foods they love. Now, you might be saying, Kathy, that's great, but what does weight loss have to do with abuse? Well, that's exactly what we're going to make clear in this episode. It's going to make this episode really impactful, and I can't wait to get into this conversation. So, Jillian, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about this with you and to share more with with listeners, because I feel like so many of us have either we've been through these types of issues, or we have a sister, we have a friend, we have a parent, we have somebody very close to us who is going through the exact same thing.
Right. Yeah. So we have a lot to dive into, a lot to kind of unpack, and I'm really excited about that. But first, I'd love to start with you telling us a little bit about your own journey. You're a trauma certified life coach, specializing in binge eating and toxic relationships. So tell us a little bit about you and what brought you to this work.
Yeah, thank you. So I decided, well, my first business was a bakery, which is kind of funny because now I help people with like emotional eating, weight loss. But I started a bakery in Bangladesh and I ran that for 2 years. It was a great experience, fell in love with entrepreneurship. And that's when I also realized I was around cake every single day. I did a lot of events, a lot of birthdays, special occasions. And so there were cakes, cookies, cupcakes, brownies that were always around. And so one of the things that I realized was I don't have to binge and overindulge on food, especially with sweets, because it's going to be here tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that and the day, right? It's like, it's not going anywhere. So what I noticed it became easier to moderate and to be mindful not to eat it. I also was in a phase where I was very like hyper aware and maybe a little avoidant of like sweets or sugar. I went towards a lot of artificial sweeteners and trying to do low sugar or low carb, which wasn't always the healthiest, but it just in terms of like a moderation aspect, I realized like the binging decreases, the overeating decreases when it's constantly around, when you have access to it all the time. And there are studies that have been done with rats that we like to quote and misquote and use as to why we are addicted to sugar or why sugar is more addictive than cocaine. And really, it's like, no, actually what we're being seen or what we see, if you look at the full study, is that the rats would binge when the food was there and then it was gone. They would binge if they were given sugar or cocaine, they would gravitate towards the sugar, not because it was more addictive, but because it's a more natural substance. And when the sugar was there constantly, they weren't binging on it. When they had food consistently, they weren't binging on it. It was when the food was taken away that there was binging. And so I think it's really important that we start to recognize like when we want to cherry pick information and cherry pick what we believe and what's going on. And so this really kind of, as I came back to the States and started working and doing some other jobs, I got more involved in the coaching realm and mindset. And as that evolved, it went into like life coaching, health coaching. And so I started off kind of in the general health weight loss space. And then in 2020, it shifted and evolved into emotional eating. And as I was realizing and healing my own relationship with food, ending my emotional eating habit. And then over the last couple of years, recognizing how this binge eating and emotional eating habit and our toxic relationship with food really mimics the toxic relationship with other people and the abuse dynamic that we can get into with these types of like dysfunctional and really disruptive relationships and the high conflict relationships that we're in. So a lot of my work has been out of my own personal growth. It's been my own personal awareness. I felt like, well, I can't be telling people to eat low carb if I'm eating ice cream every night. Like I need to work on myself too. And I also, as I was recognizing, as I got divorced in 2023, so about a year and a half ago now, and really the year prior in 2022, started waking up and realizing that childhood trauma that I had faced and that I was dealing with, the cycles that I kept on repeating even as an adult, and noticing how it's all coming together. And a lot of these cycles are really overlapping. And so it was just kind of a combination of what I was going through, the things I was noticing in clients. I also noticed that everybody who came to me to lose weight, to end emotional eating, end binge eating, they also struggled with at least one toxic person in their life, if not multiple. And so I started putting these pieces together and recognizing there's this overlap and there's this struggle where if you grow up a certain way or you learn certain behaviors as a kid, that often will manifest in other relationships as an adult, and it manifests in our relationship with ourselves, with food, with body, with how we think and talk to ourselves, with where we find our worth. So much of it is all connected. So a little bit of my backstory, kind of in line with this and just really wanting to help people, because it's hard and it's frustrating when you don't know what you're going through and you're trying to get help and you don't realize exactly what's happening.
Right. Yeah, I think that's actually the piece that I would like to dig into first is what exactly are these parallels between disordered eating or emotional eating and abuse cycles, because I think laying that groundwork will help our listeners kind of track with us through the rest of the conversation. So how do you
Yes.
see those relating?
Yeah. So I start with the chronic binge or like the chronic dieting cycle. So we'll just lay that, like I'll explain that. So I call it the restrict, binge, regret cycle. So this happens when we, like one day we wake up and we're like, I've got to lose some weight. So what do? It's like, well, I got to eat less and exercise more. It's the typical adage of like, I just got to exercise more and eat less, which most of the time we end up trying to follow starvation diets. Not very useful, not very good for us long term, but in the first couple times we do them, they can be effective short term. So we're trying to cut calories. So we're restricting where we're going, what we're doing. We often restrict life because we're trying to restrict the food. We're over exercising, overindulging there, but we can only keep it up for so long. And so whether it's spring break, summer break, kids are homesick, something happens, a special occasion, it's Valentine's Day, it's whatever, like Easter, who knows what's coming up, but something happens and there's a trigger, and we will overindulge and we will overeat and give in to the cravings, the food urges. We'll eat because it's free, because everybody else is eating. So we end up what I call binging. And it's not always a full-on binge. Sometimes it's just I fall off the diet wagon. So I'm restricting really hard, but then I go to eat. But then when I fall off, now I'm going to eat all of the things I previously restricted. But then on the back end, I feel so much shame and so much regret. And there's this like pang and this like stabby like grief and self-loathing. But that's all we know. So we just repeat this cycle over and over again. So then we wake up the next day, or maybe it's Monday, and we're like, okay, well, today I'm just going to try harder. Today I'm going to keto harder and I'm going to run more. And we can restrict for maybe a couple of days, maybe even a couple of weeks, but we find ourselves, quote, falling off the wagon yet again. And we overindulge and overconsume what we were previously trying to restrict. And we just stay stuck in this cycle over and over again. So if we think about the abuse cycle that we can get into with relationships, right? You've got your love bombing phase when it's like things are good and things are working. This is often when you are on the diet and things are, quote, working. You can follow it. You have the willpower. Things are going well. Then there is some kind of ego injury or narcissistic injury in the relationship. Something happens where there's like a trigger where they feel disrespected, shame, some kind of emotion that they don't want to feel, don't have the capacity to feel. And it comes out then in some kind of like abusive behavior is typically what happens, right? And so that it falls in line with like we can keep up our diet and our love bombing phase of the diet only for so long before we fall off, before there's some kind of external trigger typically, or we just had a stressful week and we're used to maybe solving emotions with food. And so it's like, screw it. I had a hard week. I'm going to drink a bottle of wine and eat a whole pizza myself. I'll figure it out tomorrow. I'll get back on track tomorrow. I'll start over on Monday. And so we're kind of going around this cycle, just like we go around the cycle with there's an abusive incident. Then you have your people, I call them a people pleaser. That's how I tend to identify is then I try to appease. I feel responsible for their emotions. So I feel responsible to fix them. So now it's what do I need to do? What do I need to say? How do I diffuse the situation? And how do I get us back to where we were the love bombing phase before? Because that's what, in my mind, what I used to see as love. That was like, that's what it was real love. And if there wasn't love bombing, well, that wasn't real love. The spark is gone. The chemistry is gone. Right. Just like we can talk about with diets of like, no, we want diets to feel easy. And yet at the same time, we'll tell ourselves, well, that's too easy. That couldn't possibly work. And so we get stuck in that same cycle over and over again. And the similar habit that happens when it's the emotional eating in particular. So we're restricting. And then there is some kind of trigger where we feel an emotion. Typically, it's a negative one. We can be eating for emotional, like positive emotions. I'm having so much fun. This is so good. I don't want the night to end. There can be positive things, but more often than not, we are turning to food, or we might be turning to alcohol as a coping mechanism to avoid and distract from the negative emotions that we don't want to feel. And what our brain has learned is that food creates that rapid, reliable, effective sense of relief. So it's like, okay, I might be dieting, I might be restricting. Then there's this trigger and I don't want to feel it. So now I'm going to turn to food to try to get me back to where I was before, back to where I wasn't feeling this negative emotion. And sometimes it's what's happening during the day or the week. Sometimes it's this undercurrent of belief of like, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not thin enough. Sometimes it's thoughts like I should be further along by now. I thought I was going to have a different job. I didn't think I would be here in this place. I've even had some of these thoughts before where I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting to be 40 and have been divorced twice with a 4-year-old son. And, wasn't expecting to be here. Right. And like, there can be a little bit of, I think sometimes we can have some shame about what's happening. And it's that same cycle and it's the negative self-talk. It's really not knowing our worth and our value. And it's trying to find it by controlling our bodies, by having to look a certain way, be a certain weight, have a certain shape, and then I'm more lovable. It's if I stay with this person and I endure this, if I can fix this emotion for them, if I can get them back to where we were before, now I'm good enough. So it's finding like our worthiness and our value. And that's what I see as codependency, is this story of I'm not good enough. But we are codependent as people pleasers, just like a toxic person is codependent. They need you as a people pleaser. You are like the missing piece of their puzzle. Right. So both people in this dynamic are codependent. They both need one another to play and fit this role in order for it to, quote, work, in order for it to keep going. Mm-hmm. And we're just trying to get our needs met. So we're either trying to meet our needs with the approval of someone else, by somebody else's love, somebody else's validation or praise, or trying to meet our emotional needs through food or through alcohol. So this is good for us to recognize, because as we start to break one pattern, we can then start to break others, and it becomes easier. So as we're understanding like, oh, this is the dynamic that's played out with a person, we can also see that internal dynamic of our relationship with food and the restriction, or the emotional side of things of like, I don't want to feel this, so I'm going to reach for food. And typically that's subconscious. We don't always have full awareness of it, but it's like you might notice it like you're overeating. And you're like, I don't know why, but I keep reaching for food. And I notice I'm not hungry, like not whatsoever, but I keep reaching for food. I keep overeating at lunch, or I keep overeating at dinner. I keep going for something sweet. Yeah, and I know I'm not hungry, but it's like this urge or this drive. Right. So that's usually how people will like think about it or describe it. And that's how I think of emotional eating, is we're eating and we're not physically hungry. We're eating to soothe emotions.
Right. This reminds me of when I was going through my last abusive relationship. I was over at a mentor's house, and I've told this story a million times, but I was sobbing at her kitchen table, and she said, I'm about to say something to you and you're not going to like it. Mm-hmm. And she said, you've been in several abusive relationships now, and you're the common denominator. So I think what's fascinating about this conversation already is the fact that, like, in my situation, I can look at everything that happened. And of course, it takes two to tango. But I feel like I did everything I possibly could to make that relationship work, to do whatever, what he needed to do. A lot of that those people pleasing things. And I felt like I walked away from that relationship with a completely clear conscience. And it's interesting because this is kind of flipping the script a little bit, where we're kind of taking a look inward instead of at our situation and what happened. How did this affect me, or how did I play a part in this, and how can I address those things going on in me?
Yeah. So, and this is where we can look at the other person in a relationship. But if we look at it from food, like let's look at just the food aspect. Food just sits there. It's your thoughts about it. It's your emotions about the food, about weight loss, about your body, about yourself, about your like how good you are as a person because of how you look or how much you weigh. And like we want to blame food. We want to make food the problem. And food's not the problem. I am. Like it's me, it's my unwillingness. And I always say, like, we don't have an overeating problem as much as we have an underfeeling problem. That's the real issue, is like, I'm not willing, or I don't want to feel certain emotions. So I'm going to eat over them. I'm going to self-soothe with food. And it's a very quick, rapid, reliable, like it's everywhere. We have a surplus of food that we didn't have, even 100 years ago. We didn't have to the extent that we have now. And so that's okay, but let's really take it back to, where's the control? I don't have to blame food. I don't have to try to just keep food out of the house. I don't have to avoid all the restaurants. I don't have to avoid gas stations. I don't have to avoid, right? I talk about it's like with cookies. It's like you don't have to avoid cookies, the people who bake them, the places that sell them, right? It's like, there are going to be times when we might take food out of the house to work on your relationship with it. But if you aren't doing the mental, emotional work around the food to change that dynamic as a whole, you're not going to feel any more in control when you bring it back in, which is the same thing with relationships. It's like you can start dating a different person, but if you keep vibrating on the same level and you have the same energetic level, and you never really address the internal wounds and patterns that you need to work on, you're going to keep attracting the same type of person, which is exactly what I did too. Like after my divorce, kept attracting some avoidant, narky, not so great people. And again, it was like the love bombing. That was the pivotal moment for me, was recognizing where was the love bombing, what I was looking to, and what it was like feeding my soul. It was like this really intense desire. And I didn't even realize how big it was until multiple months in, when it was like, felt so hard to break away. But
Right.
that's what I want to do, is empower people to recognize, like, we don't have to control others. We don't need to be worried and upset and like thinking about them. You focus on you. And when you can learn to meet your own emotional needs, you don't need a person to meet them, which means if there are red flags, you can walk away faster, which is always
Mhm.
important, because you still might attract some like not so healthy people, and that's okay. It's being able to walk away.
Right.
So that's really important. And then also recognizing, like, if I can meet my own emotional needs, I don't need food to do that for me.
Right. Oh, it's such a hard lesson sometimes. But when you do the work, it's so worth it. Like I
Yes.
know for myself, I kind of made the point that I wasn't going to start seeing anyone for a
Mm-hmm.
while, at least
Mm-hmm.
because I wanted to do that mental and emotional work. And I knew that that was the work
Yeah.
that needed to be done first. So
Yeah.
that's where I kind of I decided to really lean into that because I knew that I was having to make major life decisions, and that's never good coming from an emotional place. And
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like,
Right. Right.
after hearing my mentor say that to me, I was like, okay, let me look at this. And, obviously there's
Yeah.
something within me that needs to be worked on. And, it was hard work. It wasn't easy, but I did it. And I feel like now I'm healthier mentally and emotionally than I've ever been. It's a great, great place to be.
Yes. Yes. Totally.
So in your work, have you had any instances where you're working with someone who's dealing with the food issues and the relationship issues at the same time, or do they normally come to you after the relationship, or what do you
Yeah,
notice?
most often, so there's both happening at the same time. A lot of time, I would say most of my clients are already divorced. They're either like separated, maybe final stages of divorce, or they're post-divorce and they're now really working to heal their relationship with food, to lose the weight, stop emotionally eating. But there's still a lot of trauma that they've held on to from the relationship that they are also needing to work through. And so
Mm,
this might sound like if it's a woman and she was married to a man, it's like, well, he's still in my head. I still have all of his voices in my head. And then it's like, okay, but let's look. When was the last time that he said those words to you? And a lot of times it's like, well, it was like 3 years ago. It was 5 years ago, right?
right.
And it's like, okay, so now these are your voices in your own head. And
Mm,
again, let's own the power. Let's own it as, if it's my voice in my head, I have the power to change it. I don't have to change the past. I don't have to try to change him. I don't have to get him to do anything differently. I get to own this now and recognize this is my own thought. It's my own fear. It's how I've been trained. It's how I've been programmed, how I've been wired. And often it is from a very young age. And really, I think a lot of it is this like grooming, where we get used to more and more levels of abuse. It starts off really slow and like not a big deal, and maybe they're just testing some boundaries, and they're seeing like, what can they get away with, what can they do next, and they keep escalating to the point where we become numb to it. We've gotten used to it. So when you get used to it as a kid, as a young adult, and then you're in this dynamic now in a marriage, and you're there 10, 20 plus years, there's going to be a lot to unwind, right? It's like
mhm.
we just need to be able to unwind these patterns. So most people will often come as a primary goal of like weight loss, emotional eating, and there's still trauma that they're working through. And that's part of this, is understanding the narky dynamic we have within ourselves of like, I am no longer going to be the narcissist to me. I am no longer going to keep telling myself this, to keep demeaning, to keep putting myself down, to keep telling myself like shaming, like subtle shaming, like, you know better. You shouldn't be,
Right.
like, how did you let yourself get this way? That's real. Like, it might be subtle, but it's really shameful, really self-deprecating. And that's what we really need to work on, are those thoughts and how we're thinking. So it's not just about the food, right? Like a lot of times, like our binge eating, our emotional eating, it's not about the food. That's not the key. It's everything else that's going on in our lives. And that's
Right.
beautiful, because we all want to feel at peace and ease and in control around food. And we can, but like we have to have full, fun, fulfilling lives. And this is the work, is to understand like what those habits, what those patterns look like.
It's really interesting because one of the things I've been kind of digging into and exploring recently is how a lot of times when we come out of abusive relationships, we almost, because of those patterns and the things that we've been taught for so long, we almost go into this pattern of abusing ourselves. It's like
Mm-hmm.
we can't
Mm-hmm.
get past that
Right.
even with ourselves, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's just, it's fascinating to me. And it's made me kind of go like, why are we like that? Why do we do that to ourselves? Whether it's, emotional eating or anything else.
Yeah.
And
Right. And it's a habit that we learned, which means it's a habit we can unlearn, but it's just a learned behavior. It's like this is how we learn to survive. It's how we learn to cope. It's how we learn to get our needs met. It's like I growing up in a household where there were a lot of like narky dynamics. I don't know if anybody else uses the word narky, but that's the that's the word that I
it
use.
works. It works.
And it's like there were a lot of those dynamics. And so there were relationships where I showed up with that. My first marriage, I was more of the person with the toxic traits and I was looking for the spark and I was the one ending things and breaking things off, saying like, I'm like, we're just not like, we're not meant to be. And granted, we didn't live together. I saw him 3 times in 3 years. He was in the army and deployed. And like, to me, it was like a piece of paper for the army for him to live out of the barracks. It was like, but I said yes to marrying him, not because I really wanted to get married at that point. It was people pleasing. It was like, I can make his life easier if I just sign this piece of paper. But I
Mm,
didn't want anybody to know. I didn't want to be married. Like like kind of, it's like I was engaged. I just pretended like I was engaged. It was wild, but it was like, but I can make his life better. I can make it easier. Maybe we can get paid a little bit more money and then maybe we could see each other more often since we live in different states. But
right.
like, yeah, there were definitely times when I had the narky traits and recognizing like okay, what can I learn from this? And how do I shift this? How do I heal this? Right? Like that's always what we're looking at is awareness of the pattern, why it's here. Let's decode it and understand it so that we can break it and we can change it.
So fascinating. Do you think that there's any what's kind of coming up for me, what's coming to mind is like a lot of times in abusive relationships you feel like you're completely out of control, like this other
Mm-hmm.
person has all the control, you don't have any control in the situation. Do you think
Mm-hmm.
that with um like emotional eating and binging after an abusive relationship, do you think that in some senses that might be a way that people are trying to take back control, like they
Mm-hmm.
feel like
Yep.
they're in control?
Yeah. Yeah. And for some people in the relationship, it's like they may have been shamed for their weight or what they could and couldn't eat. Like, well, that's a bad food. You're not supposed to eat it. You shouldn't. There might have been like very overt, like verbal abuse around their weight, their size, their shape, anything like that. And so it could be a sense of like, haha, I'm not with you anymore. Now I'm going to eat whatever I want. Now I'm going to find control in what I'm eating outside of it. So I think sometimes it's a sense of control when we feel like we don't have any other control. We're going to restrict food. We're going to control what we're eating or how we're exercising, things like that.
Mhm.
But I see it often as more of, I get to do this, kind of like this proverbial slap in the face of the other person, but it's only harming yourself, right? It's like, well, haha, I can eat whatever I want, however much I want. But it's not, yeah, it's not healthy. And if we're really honest with ourselves, so often we feel out of control still. So we're
Mm.
just continuing that cycle of not feeling in control. We try to have it, but we feel like I have this desire, I have these cravings, these urges, and I can't control myself around the food. I just keep eating. I can't stop. It's like I can't stop myself. So this is where we, just like in a relationship, like a dysfunctional relationship like that, we have to be really honest with ourselves. We have to tell ourselves the truth. And we need to also do that when it comes to the emotional eating and the binge eating. Like no shame, no judgment. Really learn to put that to the side because those are heavy toxic traits that get used against us. Like people, right? Like a dysfunctional person is going to poke you by poking your shame button, poking your guilt button,
Mm.
those sort of things. So we have to like put that to the side and honestly evaluate and look at, why was I truly eating? And sometimes it was like, screw it, why bother? Right? And like just be really honest with yourself. Like this is where it starts.
Yeah. one of the things that I struggle with, even so many years out after this relationship, and I've just started to realize what it is I can never go to sleep on time. Like I want to be in bed at
Mm.
10:30 and go to
Uh
sleep,
huh.
and I'll sit there and I'll, grab my phone to turn the alarm on, but then, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, just scrolling and everything else. And in my head I'm telling myself you need to go to sleep, you need to go to sleep. And I'll, then next thing I know it's midnight or after.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
just started realizing recently that that is another piece of this, where it's like, even like you said, even outside of a relationship, we feel like a lot of things are outside of our control. Like, I have to work from 9 to 5, I have to make dinner, I have to do
Mm-hmm.
this, that, or the other. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, now I'm laying in bed, it's my time, I'm in control, so I can
Yeah.
just. So
Yeah.
that's something I'm personally working on now, because I know that I'm going to feel better if I go to bed on time and wake up on time. And
Right.
it's
Right.
it's so interesting the way those things like interconnect. And
Yeah.
uh,
Yes. And I just released a podcast this week. So it'll be by the time when this one comes out, it'll be a couple weeks ago now. But I talk about like making decisions from desire. And I think we're really good when it comes to like the emotional eating, binge eating side. We're really good at making decisions from desire around food. But we aren't giving ourselves what we want in life as a whole. And so often what happens, especially when we're in a toxic relationship, an abusive relationship, is we're not giving ourselves what we want. We aren't getting the love and the needs met from the other person. We don't have the relationship. We don't have the communication. We don't have the validation. We don't have the things that we're looking for. So it's like, I don't get what I want in this relationship, or I don't get what I want from my job. I don't feel fulfilled. I don't feel satisfied. But at least with food, I can give myself what I want. And it becomes this kind of like consolation prize. So what I found is that when we are so used to saying no, to restricting, to depriving, we get to the end of the night and we don't want to keep restricting. We don't want to keep telling ourselves no. And when we are getting told no by somebody else, when we feel like we're not in the relationship that we want, we're not being treated the way that we want, we aren't in the job maybe that we want, or following the career path that we want, we it's like we keep telling ourselves no, oh no, 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 all day long. And then we get to food in the evening, especially after dinner, and it's like, I don't want to keep telling myself no. At least I can get something that I want if I give myself this food. And so it can be this consolation prize, this desired, like, oh, I want this, and this is an easy thing that I can give myself. I may not be able to give myself a spouse who treats me the way I want to be treated, or where we can handle conflict, or we can have a simple meeting together without getting into a fight or an argument. But at least I can indulge in this food. At least I can give myself something that I want. And so it can be that kind of emotional turning to. And sometimes it becomes just such a habit where you can leave the relationship, that so much of the emotional dynamic is still there. We're still scarred. We're still wounded. And we're still looking maybe for someone or something else to meet our emotional needs. And so we still have that same dynamic with the food, and we don't learn how to meet our own emotional needs. Like what needs are you getting met from this other person? And I know for me, I did a little exercise around this probably about 6 months ago. And I was like, wow, I felt chosen. I felt special. I felt loved. And I feel like there was another one, but it was like those were some of the key emotions of like feeling special, feeling chosen. And it really tapped on like abandonment wounds from when I was a kid, from
hmm,
growing up and how I grew up. And even the fear or the threat of abandonment from somebody. It's like, even if I knew that they weren't great for me, it was like even them it's like the fear of them leaving and the fear of them walking away was like, no, 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 don't leave me.
hmm,
And I knew that they weren't great. I knew I shouldn't have been holding on. And yet I was still, it was like I kept holding them closer. So there's a song. Oh, there's a great song. I think it's like maybe called Toxic by like a recent singer. And it's like, it's kind of like, I tell you I don't want to see you and you pull me in closer kind of thing, right? It's like you try to break away, you try to push away, but like I only want you more kind of thing. And it really shows that trauma bond that we develop, and
hmm,
that cognitive dissonance. And I think we can be trauma bonded with food, with where it's like food is our comfort, food's how we feel better, and yet we also have so much shame for the food that we're eating. We hate food. We don't want food. We don't want to need food. And yet it's like, feels like it's our blessing and our curse at the same time. just like the human, just like a person can be.
Right.
So I think that there's a lot of similarities when we think about kind of these relationship dynamics. We reinvent, or we kind of reintegrate, reinforce them in those dynamics, but now with food, with our body image, maybe with alcohol.
I think what's interesting too is that with relationships we can walk away and we can do the inner work to try and not get involved in an abusive relationship again, and different things that we could use, drugs, alcohol. Those are things that you can, with a lot of work, eliminate from your life. But we need food to survive.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it's it's we've got to learn to create that healthy relationship so that that very thing we need to survive isn't destroying us.
Right. Right. Oh, I totally agree. And I think this is one of the differences between like pe- like alcohol or drugs or things like that. And this is why I say, like, you're not addicted to food. I don't think we feel very powerful when we think about that. It's like it feels very much out of our control. I can't help it. And we also need food to survive. So it feels very conflicting of like, I'm addicted to it, which is bad, but I need it to survive. But now it just reinforces good food versus bad food. And I'm
Hmm.
good when I eat the good food, and I'm bad when I eat the bad food. And then usually there's punishment, there's self punishment. So sometimes it's, I'm going to binge because I've been bad. And sometimes then we regret and we feel bad about the binge. So then we keep binging. Like it's just this perpetual cycle of self punishment. It
Right.
might also be I need to exercise and punish myself in the gym for what I ate the night before. So it just keeps reinforcing that same like toxic narcissistic dynamic, but within yourself.
Right. I
Yeah.
know with people who have experienced abuse, a lot of times, really, no matter what kind of abuse they've experienced, there's a lot of body image issues and things like that, like we've already talked about. And I think like coming out of it, self trust, learning to trust yourself
Mm-hmm.
again is a really big
Yes.
thing. How can we work on that with relationships and food?
Yes, yes. Okay. So this is something I work on with everybody. It's something I've had to do a lot of work on myself as well. But this is a big thing. So we're going to build trust slowly. Just like with a human, we don't like, you're not going to give out your bank account password and like login information to some random person, like your downstairs neighbor who just moved in. It's
Right.
like trust has to be built. I'm not going to give that to the guy that I'm meeting on a first date, but it's going to come incrementally. So and really it's learning to trust your judgment. So part of it is recognizing, going back and looking at what were the signs that I saw, the little nudges, the little intuition that I shut down, that I minimized, that I excused, that I justified, that I had some kind of reasoning or rationale as to why it was the way that, why he was the way he was, why she did what she did, because it's all trying to keep us safe. When really there's like this instinctual, like, something's not right. Maybe he's lying to me. I don't think she's like, that's really what happened. I don't think this is the full story that she's telling me. Like whatever it is, it's like when we can look back and recognize, like, oh, yep, nope, I had like some intuition. I had some gut knowing. I did start to see it. I questioned it. The
Right.
problem is I had to keep lying to myself because that's how I'm getting my needs met. So I have to tell myself a story that allows me to stay so I can keep getting these needs met.
Mm.
So part of it is recognizing that dynamic, because then we can start to see like, oh, okay, so I was right there. That's good. And I can trust myself then in the future with little things. We want to start with like small interactions, and trusting, like, I can trust I'm going to, pick out what I want to eat for dinner tonight. And I'm going to trust that I'm going to listen for when I'm hungry, and I'm going to stop at satisfied. Like we want to start with like some small little things. When I was building up my self trust with my body and weight loss, it was like I was terrified of carbs. So I started with like a quarter cup of rice. I started with one piece of toast. I started with a small amount, and I was like, I'm going to prove to myself I can eat a piece of toast and I'm not going to balloon up and gain 10 pounds tomorrow. Like I can
Right.
eat a little bit of rice, and I'm not going to gain all of this weight immediately. And I'm not going to binge. I'm not going to overeat, because the reality is it wasn't carbs that were the problem. It was that I kept eating like 4 protein bars, chocolate, ice cream, popcorn, jerky, and nuts at night. All of that, right? Like that
Right.
was the issue. That's why I felt like that's why I wasn't losing weight, is because of the binging and the emotional eating. it wasn't because of the carbs. That was just a story that I had. So I
Mm.
started small, and it was, let me eat one serving of carbs once a day, like intentionally. And what I found was that as I went to two servings per day. So I was like, what can I do? One at lunch, one at dinner. Can I do one with breakfast? Because I'm usually not too hungry for breakfast, but maybe it's like brunch and then dinner. And then
Mhm.
it really, I noticed like, oh, when I eat carbs, I actually have fewer cravings. Like when I eat, I'm fueling my body properly and I'm not terrified and trying to avoid certain food groups. I actually have fewer cravings. I have fewer urges. I don't have such a strong desire for it because I'm feeding my body and fueling it the way it needs to be fueled. Same thing's going to work then with relationships. Like when you are learning to meet your emotional needs, when you are loving yourself, when you are talking nicely to yourself, when you make yourself feel special, when you choose yourself, like things like that, like it depends on what the needs are that you're looking outside of yourself for. But when you give yourself that, we don't need to go seeking it. It doesn't have the same desire or appeal from somebody else. But it's going to be it's a small step. So it's like if you're going to go out on a date, or you might even trust yourself before you're on that first date. Like I trust that I can see red flags. And if you're like on a dating app, I'm going to trust that I can look at profiles and I can see red flags in these profiles, and I'm going to swipe left or I'm going to block them. Right? It's like part of it is being willing to be seen as a bitch, being willing to be seen as the villain, as the
Mm.
bad guy, as the rude person. That willingness, because so often I think that's how we were gaslit, is like we were told like, well, that was rude, you shouldn't have done that, you needed to do this differently. And we take that on as like, well, I don't want to be seen that way, I don't want to be misunderstood, so now I'm going to give people the benefit of the doubt when I really should be more skeptical. And
Mhm.
it's trusting those little nudges along the way, and uh, like letting that build, and it's slow trust with other people, trusting that you'll see the red flags, trusting that you can walk away. And this is where I think having a coach, a therapist, a community, a good friend who understands these dynamics, somebody that you can talk to about this, that you can also get external feedback, because so often it's easier for other people on the outside to see things that we can't always see for ourselves. So just as like a little aside, I think that's been like really beneficial for me and such a huge part of my own growth and healing over the last couple of years.
That's great. Yes, just like my mentor. She was
Yes,
able to see
right,
what I could not see.
right,
I was
absolutely.
I was sitting at her kitchen table going, "This happened to me and this happened to me and this happened to me." And
Yeah,
she's like,
yeah,
why? Let's look
right,
at why that happened to you." Yeah.
right. Yep.
Yeah. So, um I like to tie things back around to the beautiful. What would you say in your line of work has been the most beautiful thing that you've experienced?
When people, like especially for like the men and the women that I work with, coming out of often toxic relationships where they've been so beaten down and so devalued, and they finally start to like compliment themselves. They're like, man, I did really good today, or I'm so proud of myself for this, or I feel really pretty today, like I look smoking hot. And it doesn't matter what their size, shape, or weight is. It's like they're learning to feel good about themselves. And this is, I think, really important for us to see, because like men are in toxic relationships too. There are
Hmm.
very abusive and dysfunctional women, and they tear the men down. And so men need to learn how to do this just as much as women. And it's like really becoming your own biggest cheerleader, your biggest advocate, your number one fan, and really like being able to genuinely compliment yourself, to have that internal like self-love, and having your own back, like really being there by your side and being that advocate that I think many of us wanted for so long and we never had. And it's learning to become that for yourself. But that is one of the most beautiful parts of my work, is when people and like learn to compliment themselves, like truly genuinely learn to feel proud, learn to feel beautiful, learn to feel valued and accepted, because they feel that way about themselves.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, as we start to kind of wrap up a little bit, is there anything else that you wanted to cover or talk about that we didn't touch on?
It's so hard, right? Because there's like
so much.
there's so much. I feel like that's the kind of like the biggest piece, is what we covered, or just understanding these cycles and how they play out, and recognizing like it's this, just like the relationship with people and these dynamics. It's habits that you learned. They're habits you can unlearn. Same thing is with food. Same thing is with alcohol. It's a habit you can learn. It's a habit you can unlearn. And there's freedom, and there is peace, and there is hope. And we have to be willing to look at ourselves and look at our patterns and habits honestly. There's a great quote that I love, that I would love to share here, because
Sure.
I feel like it's so, like, it just, to me, it just resonates so much. But it says, the degree to which a person can grow is directly proportional to the amount of truth they can accept about themselves without running away.
Mm.
And so again, it's like, let's bring it back to you. Like, what are you willing to face and look at all of the truth? And it doesn't have to be all at once, but like, are you willing to do the work to be consistent, to look at what is that truth that you need to face about yourself? Because that's where the growth is.
Oh, I love it so much, so much. Well, I have one final question. I ask all of my guests this, and I love hearing the various answers. What would you say is your definition of tragically beautiful?
I love these two words together. It's like beauty out of tragedy. It is, like, tragically beautiful to me means it is like, it's like, I think of another word would be like heartbreakingly beautiful, right? It's like when it's like, I think of like when my grandfather lost my grandmother, and he's like heartbroken, but it's beautiful because you see the love that's there, right? We see the love through the grief, and this idea of like, we can turn tragedy and we can turn pain into beauty. It's kind of like the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly. We
Mm.
have to go through this gooey yucky stage of like really like turning into this messy middle part before we can turn into this beautiful butterfly to where we can fly. And so it's just recognizing that beauty can come out of pain, that you have gone through this for a reason. What can you learn? And you're not broken. You are not, somehow damaged goods, that there is value and beauty in you because of this. And sometimes this is just what we needed to wake us up, to get us to really be honest with ourselves, and to look at what we need to really adjust within us, that we can control the patterns, and what we can own.
Mm. Love it, love it. Um, I kind of lied. One more, one more
That's
question.
fine.
What is it that you're currently working on, and where's the best place for people to find you if they want to follow along or learn how they can work with you?
Yeah. So a great place is going to be my podcast. It's called Hungry for Love. That, is on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So that is a great place that you can find me. I have been working on more of these kind of like workshops and podcast episodes, really just kind of tying and linking these two pieces together. So that way we have some awareness and understanding. Most people who come to me, they already recognize that there has been an abusive relationship. They see that dynamic playing out, and now it's really working to end the abusive relationship within themselves. And so that's a great place. My website is called bodyyoucrave.com. So you can find me over there. There's free workshops and trainings. And you can find me on Instagram as well at Jillian Almadea. So I'm sure all of those will be linked.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that is really what I am after, and what I'm on a mission to do this year is really bring together the awareness of how these two concepts are linked, and also to remind you, like, you're not alone in this, that there are a lot of people who struggle, and there is hope and there is freedom.
Awesome. Well, Jillian, thank you so much for spending your time with us and for helping us to connect the dots between these two very similar patterns, and also just understand how we can work on ourselves, control the controllables, and make this the best, beautiful life we ever had.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.
Wow, what an incredible conversation. Okay, tell me the truth. Have you ever thought about the similarities between the patterns of abusive relationships with people and the patterns of unhealthy relationships with food? I certainly hadn't, but after sitting with Jillian, I can totally see the connections and it all completely makes sense. As always, I hope you enjoyed this episode and our entry into a brand new season of the podcast. Thank you so much for being here, for supporting me in this endeavor, and continuing to listen to each episode I release. It really means the world to me. If you find this kind of content helpful on your own healing journey, pop on over to my website at kathywisniewski.com and join my email list so you can stay up to date on all things Tragically Beautiful, as well as everything I'm working on in my coaching business, True and Lasting Wellness. That's kathywisniewski.com, and I'll have that linked for you in the show notes. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing, writing a review, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, or taking a screenshot of the episode and tagging us on Instagram at Tragically Beautiful Podcast. If you or someone you know might like to be a guest on a future episode, you can apply by going to tragicallybeautiful.me and completing the form. For any links or resources mentioned in today's episode, be sure to check the show notes. If you are currently in an abusive situation where you feel in physical danger, please find a safe place and call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. This number is included in the show notes in case you cannot write it down immediately. Finally, as a disclaimer, I am not a doctor, psychiatrist, or any other form of medical professional. I am a health coach, but that's something completely different. I'm simply someone who's survived several abusive relationships and have stories I'm ready to share with the world in hopes that maybe even one person can be helped. Anything you hear on this podcast is for informational purposes only. The Tragically Beautiful podcast is released each month, so be sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time a new episode is released. Until then, remember, you may have experienced tragedy, but it has made you tragically beautiful.